Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Inka Vat. Here in Taiwan, we're just about to welcome a new year with the Lunar New Year holiday just around the corner. This makes it a good time to gaze into our crystal balls and see what lies ahead in 2024. Luckily, we have some special guests with us today to help us do just that. We're joined by John Lee, Senior Fellow at Hudson Institute, visiting from Sydney, and Chenlung Kuo, Deputy Editor-in-Chief at Taiwan's United Daily News. Both a very warm welcome to the show today.
My pleasure.
John, let me get started with you first. What are the top three risks for the Indo-Pacific region?
Now, these are my top three, and when I think they're risks, I'm not saying they're likely, but they are risks with big consequences. One, an unintended escalation in the Taiwan Straits. Two, a power vacuum within China, within the Chinese Communist Party, should something happen to Xi Jinping. And three, a flare-up in the Middle East crisis leading to a Middle East war and therefore American distraction.
Yes, absolutely. And we heard that the 3 US troops were actually killed for the first time since October 7th.
It's pretty clear that an escalation is proceeding gradually. Whether it becomes an entrenched one remains to be seen.
Okay. And Chenlung?
Besides the Taiwan Strait crisis, as John had mentioned, there's other two I have in mind. One is, I think what happened in the South China Sea, especially the tension between Philippines and China, is the one we should look at. The other would be on North Korea, especially North Korea is building a military alliance with Russia these days and upgrade its military technology. And within this year, it will start to making some noises and try to get attention that would certainly endanger the situation.
Okay, so both of you identified the Taiwan Strait. Let's dive in with that. John, what do you expect might happen in 2024, or give us, the factors, the variables?
Well, since the Nancy Pelosi visit, what the PRC has done, it has increasingly violated Taiwanese airspace and maritime space with ever more dangerous and provocative manoeuvres. Now, these are designed to coerce and intimidate. They're not designed to start a war. But if you have a situation where there is an accident, for example, a loss of Chinese life, it's very difficult, if you read the political situation inside China, it's very difficult for Xi Jinping to step back, to not respond to that. And that's what I'm afraid of. And we've had a few close calls in the Taiwan Straits and in fact in the East China Sea and South China Sea as well. So if there were a loss of life due to an accident, it's very hard for Xi Jinping to de-escalate or not respond in a very robust manner. And
this is because of the nationalism that's been whipped up by certain quarters?
Yes, well, nationalism in China, it's been described as riding a tiger. It's a very dangerous thing. You can encourage it, you can make it work for you, but it's dangerous, and when it happens, it's very difficult to just pull it back. So if something dramatic like that happens, and a loss of life is always dramatic, I'm not quite sure that Xi Jinping, as powerful as he has the political capital to just sit there and not escalate the situation.
Chenlung, we all saw the CSIS survey of 87 US and Taiwan experts, and they predicted that there could be a crisis in the Taiwan Strait this year as a result of Lai Ching-te's inauguration. They said that not a full invasion, but something that would be classed as a crisis, perhaps a blockade. What do you believe the situation is?
I think there's two scenarios of escalation. One is, like you said, after the May 20th, after Lai Ching-te sworn in as the president, I think China would have to do something in order to mount a pressure on Lai Ching-te. What would that be would keep everyone guessing. Maybe it's a blockade, maybe there's more warplanes circling Taiwan. That's one thing. The other thing is the accident, as John had mentioned. The accident, I think, now is less likely between the US and China these days because they now have resumed the military dialogue. But I'm more concerned about the accident between Taiwan and Chinese military.
Okay, now that's interesting because Eurasia, different to both of you experts, have basically relegated US China tensions. It doesn't have that as a risk for 2024. It believes that's a red herring. It says that both sides will seek to de-escalate. Neither of the two biggest economies are looking for reasons to start another conflict, they say, despite the lack of trust, etc. However, John, if the PLA is sending increasing number of incursions into Taiwan's airspace, then that would be the result, the greater risk for mishap.
Well, a couple of things there. The first thing is that unintended escalation element. The second thing is I don't think it's right or I would disagree with the Eurasia Group in calling it a red herring, because that suggests that it's an exaggerated threat. For me, it's not exaggerated, because when someone like Xi Jinping says something, we should believe him. And what does he say? He says that the PLA should be ready for war in 3 years. Now, that doesn't mean they will go to war in 3 years, but he is saying the PLA must be ready for war in 3 years. He certainly had said that he wants to resolve the Taiwan question, which means integrating Taiwan into the mainland. Now, once again, not necessarily by force, but as political events go, it seems to me that there is very little or zero appetite by the Taiwanese people to voluntarily integrate into the mainland. And therefore, if Xi Jinping really wants Taiwan, force or at least some kind of relentless coercion is his only way forward. So for me, it's not a red herring. I'm not predicting any kind of war, but to say it's a red herring tends to downplay the seriousness, and I don't think that's correct.
And obviously Tonglin would agree with that, because you're saying
yes.
they could carry out a blockade, which is actually classed as an act of war under international law.
I think there's 2 points that Eurasia have been raising. It is quite plausible. One is that now the U.S. is having dialogue with China. The San Francisco summit and the past dialogue between Jack Sullivan and Wang Yi in Bangkok. That is a positive sign that will release some of the tension or misunderstanding. And there's another thing, that Chinese economy is slowing down, and that the top priority for Chinese leader is going to take care of the economy rather than any of the dangerous move there.
Yeah, just a quick comment on this. The dialogue between the Americans and the Chinese at the senior levels, including the National Security Advisor.
And an upcoming phone call.
And the upcoming phone call. Dialogues are always positive, but my worry about the dialogue is that what the Americans are trying to achieve is establish what they call guardrails. That is, specific measures that will prevent any unintended escalation. The Chinese very explicitly don't want to agree to guardrails because they see it as a tactical restriction on their options.
Yeah, very interesting.
I think also what the Americans have been hoping is having this dialogue, they can have the cooperation and competition doing at the same time. I mean, having this competition, they hope they can win the cooperation, for instance, diplomatically on China's help in pressuring Iran on the Red Sea navigation.
Okay. John, just on CSIS again, there's a report where they do look at 2024. Jude Blanchett writes in there that Beijing's cross-strait approach stands at an inflection point. So what he's saying is, 8 years of Taiwan, the Democratic Progressive Party has not made Taiwanese hanker after a return to Mind Zhou's pro-China or pro-integration stance. What do you make of that?
Yeah.
Beijing must, completely change.
Jude is correct, but if I could rephrase in my own words what I think he's saying, I think Xi Jinping is at an inflection point. And the reason why I focus this on Xi Jinping, as I mentioned, he's the first and only Chinese leader since Deng to say that he will resolve the Taiwan question. Now, as you mentioned, he's further from resolving the Taiwan question than was the case when he first came to power. So that's an inflection point. Does he continue to stake his legitimacy on getting Taiwan? Or does he try to move on? I'm afraid, or I suspect it'll be the former. As we find with rulers that centralize power amongst themselves, Putin is one of them, Xi Jinping is another. When they make a pledge to solidify their power, it's very difficult for them to walk back from it. So that's really what I'm afraid of.
But he has done U-turns. I mean, there was the COVID lockdown U-turn. I don't know, maybe you classify that as different. Chenlung, do you believe that Xi Jinping is more cautious, more conservative than Putin, or not?
What I'm thinking is more like a Chinese, thinking that Xi Jinping wants to have a step to go down, meaning that he wants to demand from the back of a tiger. You can see that from the Taiwan Affairs Office, the night when Taiwan election is finished, they have the comment seem to suggest that after all, there's a majority of Taiwan do not support Lai Ching-te. Lai Ching-te only got 40% of the votes. I think now China want to find a way to de-escalate, but in a sense that they want to save their face.
So does that mean you are going counter to what John said, in that you believe that he might step back from the Taiwan?
I think the most dangerous thing is what's happening within China. I think there's a lot of resentment against Xi Jinping nowadays, and everyone wants to find an excuse to criticize Xi Jinping. And being a failure on the Taiwan policy, that's the perfect excuse. All the nationalism will come out.
For me, when I look at what's happening, whether it's Taiwan Straits, East China Sea, South China Sea, I don't see any signs of China de-escalating. The incursions are just as frequent as before. In fact, they're becoming more dangerous and more frequent. But what I think Xi Jinping wants to do is escalate without provoking a kinetic response. The problem with that framework is Xi Jinping does not have perfect information as to what will and won't provoke a kinetic response. And we saw that during COVID and during his economic management. He does not get people who tells him things that he doesn't want to hear. No one around him says, no, don't do that. That kind of dynamic, and you can't quantify, qualify that. That sort of dynamic to me is very dangerous.
Now, someone who doesn't think that a major escalation in the Taiwan Strait is likely in 2024 is Miles Yu, Hudson Institute China Center Director and Senior Fellow, and the Principal China Advisor to former US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. This is what he had to say. Take a look.
I predict that China is going to work more on the United States and to basically to strengthen their effort to convince the United States from backing Taiwan. So I doubt that China is going to be able to convince the United States, particularly in recent years. All presidents, no matter which party he belongs to, always say that the United States, regardless of what happened in the U.S.-China relationship, always opposes the use of force to change the status quo.
Joe Biden has made it clear what his position is by 4 times saying that he would have America defend Taiwan. But when it comes to Donald Trump, he in interviews has said that he wouldn't say. Could he be a US president that China could persuade in terms of making them back down from their support of Taiwan?
I don't believe there has ever been strategic ambiguity on Taiwan. Since Jimmy Carter unilaterally terminated the Mutual Defense Treaty, every president of the United States has always vowed to intervene militarily if China attempts to take Taiwan through force. And the Chinese government understands this very well. So that's why there has always been peace and stability along Taiwan Strait. The ambiguity is there, but it's not strategic. It's a tactical. It deals with operational security. The United States is not going to tell China, to tell the world how they're going to respond, but they're going to respond for sure. Trump had, of course, holds the same idea, but he has a different approach on this issue.
Many people are calling him isolationist. Is there really that bedrock of support for Taiwan? How important is Taiwan to Trump?
I think it's very important. It's not accurate to describe President Trump as an isolationist. He's American first president. American first. You may say that he's not a globalist, but he's not an isolationist. Peace and stability of the world also is part of the Americans' national interest. It's just we want to make sure that America is not going to take care of the whole world. You saw President Trump play a tough love on our allies in Europe and in Asia, but that means that he really wants to increase the sort of equitable burden sharing among friends and allies.
One final question, if I may. How do you think Xi Jinping is preparing for a possible Trump presidency?
I think Xi Jinping is pretty much stay up every night figuring out how to deal with a potential Trump second term. The famous formula developed by Mao then and particularly Jiang Zemin is called to use confrontation to extract cooperation from the United States. Not going to work very well with President Trump the second term, because we don't believe in being conciliatory to confrontation deliberately. So we're going to respond with real strength. And that's why during 4 years of Trump administration, there was no cranky action by the Chinese government, because they know there will be consequences.
That was Miles Yu speaking to me earlier. He was a Hudson Institute colleague of John's and also former advisor to Mike Pompeo, former US Secretary of State. John, if I can ask you, so Miles said there has never been really strategic ambiguity, also that Taiwan is very important to Trump.
On strategic ambiguity, I agree with 3/4, or I go 75% of where Miles goes. And what I mean by that is, it is true strategic ambiguity as a concept has become less useful now, because it was useful at a time when the fear was as much about Taiwan declaring independence as it was about what the PRC would do. Now, I don't think there's any fear about Taiwan declaring independence, but there's a lot of fear about what the PRC will do. In my view, it would be unthinkable that the United States would not intervene. Now, there's still an element of ambiguity, though, and that is, how would the United States intervene?
With the tactical stuff that he was saying.
Yeah, and there is some ambiguity around that, and that matters. That's not just playing word games. But from that perspective, I agree 75% of where Miles is coming from.
And how about Trump's support of Taiwan?
I think that Xi Jinping will be hoping that Trump won't be as supportive of Taiwan as Biden has been, for example, publicly. I tend to think that's a mistake by Xi Jinping. Yes, Trump does say some very unpredictable things, but if you look at his first term as president, and secondly, if you look at in a potential Trump presidency, the people around him, they're not isolationists. They are people who, in fact, want to use American power to get a better deal for America, but two, use American power to coerce. So if I was Xi Jinping, I wouldn't put too much on this idea that Trump will be your savior and that will allow you to invade Taiwan. I think that would be a grave mistake by Xi Jinping.
Okay. Now let's talk about how Xi might be preparing for a possible Trump presidency. Would that be through economic coercion? And as Miles said, would that backfire?
Well, I think initially Xi will play very nicely with Donald Trump if he becomes president, and he'll try to aim for some kind of deal where China offers America some very attractive trade deal in return for America effectively not agreeing to defend the Taiwanese.
What sort of attractive trade deal, though?
Well, we all know that Donald Trump is very obsessed about trade surpluses, so China could very easily remove the trade surpluses that it has with the United States.
You think that they would go that far?
If they actually got Taiwan in return, yes, I do, because I think she's the sort of person that prioritises strategic and security objectives. But I don't think the Americans under Trump or anyone else would take that deal. And so then you would revert to back to what we have now, which is China continuing to relentlessly coerce, intimidate, to try to break the will of the Taiwanese people to resist.
Yeah, and other Asian countries and US allies. Chenlung, should we move now to your other top risks that you've identified? You identified the South China Sea and North Korea.
I think those two areas are the things that, I mean, not only Xi Jinping will be losing sleep if President Trump have his second term. I think all the leaders around the world will be losing sleep. For instance, Marcos president in Philippines will be worried whether Trump or the American will honor its commitment, security commitment, if there is ever going to be a conflict between China and Philippines.
John, so in the South China Sea, we know from the Philippines announcement that they have the budget to start developing the outposts, the islands, the reefs within their own territory. Now, this is obviously to state their claim of sovereignty over the Chinese. So how far does China go this year in obstructing that?
I don't think China will go as far as to do something that would deliberately provoke a war or some kind of kinetic response for the same reasons that we gave, that the impact on China would be too great and the prize would not be great enough.
But continuing what it's been doing in terms of the second Thomas Shoal, you know, sort of bullying the supply ships.
Yes, but I think the United States and allies have some level of agency in this. I mean, in my view is that China has been as coercive in the South China Sea because there have been practically no consequences for China in being coercive. And we've got to this point where the longer we wait to push back, the greater the price it is for pushing back. So that's where we found ourselves. But I do think the countries are trying to correct that. As you mentioned, the Philippines has changed changed around quite a bit from the Duterte period. And now it is trying to act as a proper ally in return for getting security guarantees, which it has got from the Biden administration. So for that reason, I don't think that the Chinese would want to deliberately provoke any kind of response. It will go as far as it's allowed to go. Now, when you talk about other South China Sea claimants like Vietnam, for example, which doesn't have an alliance agreement with anyone, that's a different issue. But the Philippines, I think the Chinese will be constantly calculating what that threshold is that they can go without provoking anything.
Chenlung, do you want to move on to North Korea? You briefly mentioned this. Interesting, isn't it, that North Korea has now stated that the South is its sworn enemy, is no longer, you know, the half of the country that it wants to reunify with, but now it simply wants to annex it. Also, just recently, they tested the second submarine-launched cruise missile.
Right. I think now North Korea is want to make as loud a noise as possible in order to force the next president to get into another negotiation with the North. And by threatening the South Korea, that's a part of the strategy, I think. Right.
And so do we expect, so it's all noise rather than action, real substance?
With North Korea, well, what I'd say, you know, there's a couple of things going on. The first thing is that, as been correctly mentioned, North Korea is playing a more active role. You know, it's now directly arming Russia, we're led to believe. It's making a lot of progress developing solid fuel cells for its missiles, which make them less defendable, or more difficult to defend against. Now, that creates, obviously, that increases the coercive capacity of Pyongyang. But what it does as well is that it potentially creates a headache for China, because China doesn't want North Korea to create problems that China doesn't want. China wants to be the one that gets to define what problems it creates for the United States and the West.
And so if it becomes a problem for China, it means that it probably wouldn't come to fruition, that it will just stay making lots of noise, trying to draw attention.
North Korea is a double-edged sword for China. On the one hand, China avoid to be seen as building a trilateral alliance between North Korea, Russia, and China. They are having an ambiguous attitude toward it. But on the other hand, if North Korea become really issues, that the U.S. still will turn to China to putting pressure on North Korea. That would create some kind of leverage for China. So you can see the things from both sides, right?
Okay.
Yeah, you know, China does not want North Korea to provoke a war on the Korean Peninsula, because then China would have to be involved, the United States would be involved, South Korea would be involved, perhaps Japan would be involved. China I put this very flippantly, China only wants to enter wars of its own choosing, and the Korean Peninsula isn't one of them.
But that wouldn't provide the distraction, for example, if she wants to move on Taiwan.
Well, the problem is that the Chinese would still have to be probably involved, because if the North Korean forces were defeated, the Chinese couldn't tolerate a allied force in the Korean Peninsula, on the whole
So
Korean
close to,
Peninsula.
yeah.
So China would have to defend North Korea, so China would be tied down as well.
Right, so there'd be the two war theatres,
Yeah.
which it doesn't
Yeah.
want. Okay. Now, very intriguingly, you listed as one of your top risks a power vacuum in Beijing with
Yeah.
something happening to Xi Jinping.
I put it as one of my top risks, once again, not because I think it will necessarily happen, or I don't think, it's not that I think it will probably happen, it's more that if it happens, the consequences will be immense and unpredictable. And what I'm getting at is that, as we all know, Xi Jinping, unlike his predecessors, has centralized power around himself. It's not power by committee. He chairs all of the small leading groups. They're not ministries that make decisions, it's small leading groups that make decisions. He chairs all the major ones. Even if you look at the Standing Committee of the Politburo, only those who are personally loyal to Xi Jinping are there. He gets the institutions, the PLA, to swear allegiance not to the CCP but to Xi Jinping himself. And when you have the sort of untransparent and fragile institutions that China has, I have no idea what would actually happen and how China would be governed the day after Xi Jinping, but neither does anyone else. So that worries me as well.
Chenlung, final thoughts on that? Many people would be rejoicing.
Right. I agree with John has said, because by not having an obvious successor, Xi Jinping can keep its power to the maximum. And he will remain that status until maybe the last second of his rule.
Okay, we're going to have to wrap it up there. Thank you so much, John Lee and Chenlung Kuo, for joining Taiwan Talks today.